August 20th, 1945, Opera Harbor, Guam. Picture this moment. Nearly 300 Japanese women, most of them barely out of their teens, stepping onto a transport ship's gangway wearing faded khaki uniforms that had seen better days. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were nurses who had cradled dying men in field hospitals across the Pacific. They were radio operators who had transmitted the Empire's increasingly desperate orders as the war turned against them. Some were students, girls who had just turned 18 when they were pulled from their classrooms and thrust into a war machine that had promised them honor and delivered nothing but devastation. They moved in complete silence, surrounded by American guards whose very presence contradicted everything their government had ever told them about the enemy. Before we go deeper into this incredible story, do me a favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, whether it's Tokyo, New York, or anywhere in between, because this is a story that deserves to reach every corner of the world. Now, as these women boarded the ship, something strange happened. They started stealing glances at the American sailors managing the vessel, and what they saw didn't match anything they'd been taught. These weren't the weak, malnourished men from the propaganda posters plastered across Japan for years. These sailors stood tall with broad shoulders, moving with a casual strength that seemed almost unreal. One nurse named Yuki Tanaka would later write a single haunting line in her journal that captured what so many of them were feeling in that moment. She wrote, "If everything they told us about their weakness was a lie, what else did they hide from us?" The full weight of that question hadn't hit them yet, but as the ship pulled away from Guam's battered shores and turned east toward the American mainland, 300 women began a 10-day journey that would completely demolish the manufactured reality they had lived inside for years. They thought they were traveling to imprisonment, maybe even execution. They had no idea they were actually sailing straight toward the truth. To really understand the shock that was waiting for them, you need to understand the world these women had grown up in. Since the early 1930s, every Japanese citizen had been fed a carefully crafted narrative through every newspaper they read, every radio broadcast they heard, every single lesson taught in their classrooms. America was portrayed as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing and capitalist greed. Its people were lazy, its men had gone soft from too much luxury, its women were vulgar and immoral. The Empire's propaganda machine painted vivid pictures of American cities falling apart at the seams. They described factories sitting silent and abandoned, bread lines stretching for miles through starving cities. These weren't just random lies thrown out carelessly. Every false claim was a calculated psychological weapon designed to make unthinkable sacrifice feel acceptable. If your enemy was already on the verge of collapse, then your own starvation made sense somehow. If their soldiers were inferior and weak, then your brother's death on some distant island had real meaning. The Ministry of Information controlled absolutely everything, every photograph, every statistic, every whispered rumor that reached the public. By 1945, most ordinary Japanese civilians genuinely believed with all their hearts that America was on the verge of total collapse. The women climbing onto that transport ship carried this manufactured worldview deep in their bones. Take Sachiko Yamamoto, a 22-year-old nurse from Hiroshima who had spent 3 brutal years treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals scattered across the Pacific Theater. She had watched boys her own age die in her arms, whispering bonsai with their last breaths, absolutely convinced their sacrifice would save the homeland. She had gone weeks at a time eating nothing but watery rice gruel and whatever dried fish they could scrounge up, all while being told that American soldiers were starving even worse than they were. When her commanding officer finally surrendered in August, Sachiko genuinely assumed they would all be executed immediately. That's what happened to prisoners of war. Everyone knew it. The Americans were barbaric like that, or so she'd been told her entire life. But the first tiny crack in her reality appeared before the ship even left the harbor. An American medic, a woman with golden blonde hair and a crisp white uniform that looked like it had been pressed that morning, came aboard to examine the Japanese prisoners for infectious diseases. She worked quickly and efficiently, but here's what shocked Sachiko the most. There was no cruelty in her movements. When Sachiko flinched during the examination, the American medic actually smiled and said something in English that sounded gentle. An interpreter standing nearby translated the words. "You're safe now," she had said. "No one's going to hurt you." Sachiko didn't believe it, couldn't let herself believe it. Kindness from the enemy had to be just another form of torture, some twisted mind game. But then the examination ended and the medic did something completely unexpected. She offered Sachiko a piece of candy, real sugar wrapped in bright, colorful paper. Something shifted in that moment. The woman's hands were steady and her nails were clean and her skin looked healthy and strong. These were not the hands of someone whose nation was supposedly starving to death. The ship departed at dawn the next morning. For the first few hours, the women sat together in complete silence down in the cargo hold, which had been converted into temporary quarters with metal bunks and wool blankets. They expected deprivation. They braced themselves for punishment and cruelty. What they got instead was lunch, and not just any lunch. American sailors came down carrying metal trays absolutely loaded with food. There was white bread, soft and fresh with a texture none of them had felt in years. Canned peaches swimming in thick, heavy syrup. Beef stew with actual visible chunks of meat floating in rich brown gravy. Individual portions of real butter. Coffee that smelled dark and rich and absolutely intoxicating. And the portions, my God, the portions were insane. There was more food on a single tray than most of these women had seen in an entire week back home in Japan. First, nobody touched anything. They just stared at the trays like the food might be poisoned or like this was all some elaborate cruel joke. Then one woman, a radio operator named Kiko Sato, slowly reached out and picked up a piece of bread. She tore it apart carefully, examining the texture between her fingers, bringing it close to her face to smell it. This was white bread made from pure white flour with no sawdust mixed in, no tree bark, no rice husks, nothing but actual flour. She took a small, cautious bite. Her eyes went wide. She took another bite, then another, eating faster now as tears started streaming down her face. That single moment broke the dam wide open. 300 women fell on the food like starving wolves, because that's exactly what they were. Starving women whose bodies had been consuming themselves for months. And as they ate, as the sugar hit their bloodstreams and the protein began the slow work of rebuilding their wasted muscles, a terrible question formed simultaneously in 300 minds. If they have this much food to give to prisoners, how much do they possibly have for themselves? The meals continued like this 3 times every single day for 10 straight days. Breakfast brought real eggs with toast and jam. Lunch varied between thick sandwiches stuffed with meat and cheese or soups so rich and creamy they seemed almost obscene. Dinner always, without fail, included protein and vegetables and bread and dessert. There was always dessert, cookies or cake or pudding or fruit cocktail drowning in syrup so sweet it almost hurt your teeth. On the 3rd day, Sachiko was standing near the deck, when she watched an American sailor casually scrape half-eaten food off his plate straight into a garbage bin. She felt something physically break inside her chest. That discarded food, thrown away like it meant absolutely nothing, would have fed her entire family for 2 solid days. She suddenly remembered her mother's hands, always shaking from chronic malnutrition. Her little brother, who was 8 years old but whose growth had been permanently stunted from years of hunger. Her father, a factory worker who had given away his own rice portions to his children until he became too weak to work at all. And here, the enemy was throwing perfectly good food into the ocean like it was worthless. Kiko Sato had a similar devastating revelation. She had spent 18 months broadcasting false victory reports from her radio station, reading carefully scripted announcements about American defeats that had never actually happened. She had known they were lies, every single radio operator knew, but she had believed the core underlying narrative. America was stretched impossibly thin, struggling desperately, rationing everything down to the last crumb. That's why the lies were necessary, to keep civilian morale up during what was supposed to be the final push toward ultimate victory. But on day 5 of the voyage, she watched the ship's cook dump an entire massive pot of rice overboard because it had been slightly overcooked. An entire pot of rice, enough to feed a whole platoon of soldiers, just dumped into the sea like garbage because it wasn't perfect. She found an interpreter, a Japanese-American woman wearing a crisp U.S. Army uniform, and cornered her with an almost desperate question. "Why are you wasting food like this?" she demanded. "Is this some kind of trick? Are you trying to break our spirits and demoralize us?" The interpreter looked genuinely confused by the question. "Wasting," she said slowly, "honey, the galley makes completely fresh meals 3 times every day. They have to dump whatever's left over because there's literally nowhere to store it all." "But what about the rationing?" Kiko pressed. "What about all the shortages?" The interpreter's confusion only deepened. "What rationing?" she asked. "America hasn't rationed food since 1943, and even back then it was completely voluntary, mostly just sugar and butter, nothing serious at all." Kiko felt the entire world tilt sideways beneath her feet. No rationing at all. Food so incredibly abundant they literally had to throw massive amounts away every single day. She had spent 1.5 years of her life broadcasting detailed stories about American starvation, American desperation, American cities on the verge of collapse. All lies, every single word of it. That night down in the hold, whispered conversations began spreading through the darkness. Hesitant at first, voices barely above a breath, but growing gradually bolder. "Did you see the guard's boots?" Someone whispered. "Brand new leather, not a scratch on them. The blankets they gave us are real wool. When was the last time any of us saw actual wool?" The medic had real medicine in her bag, morphine and sulfa drugs, not that useless military garbage that barely works. One woman, a university student named Hana Ishikawa who had been conscripted straight from her classes, finally said out loud what everyone was thinking. Everything was a lie, she whispered into the darkness. The response wasn't immediate agreement. Not yet. Instead, it was anger and fear. "Shut your mouth," someone hissed from across the hold. "You're gonna get us all punished." But the seed had been planted deep, and with every single meal, with every glimpse of casual, thoughtless American abundance, it grew stronger. On the 7th day, the California coastline appeared on the horizon. The women were allowed up on deck in small shifts to exercise and get fresh air. Sachiko stood at the metal railing, gripping it so hard her knuckles turned white, watching the shoreline slowly materialize through the morning fog. And then San Francisco emerged from the mist, and her entire world ended right there. Skyscrapers, dozens upon dozens of them, massive towers of steel and glass stabbing upward into the clouds like something from a dream. The Golden Gate Bridge, impossibly huge and painted that bright orange color, carrying what looked like hundreds of vehicles across the bay in both directions. The docks below were absolutely swarming with activity. Massive cranes loading and unloading cargo ships, warehouses the size of entire city blocks, freight moving in what looked like organized chaos. And beyond the waterfront, the city itself spread out endlessly, buildings stacked up the hills, streets laid out in perfect grids, lights beginning to wink on as evening approached. This was supposed to be a dying nation. This was supposed to be defeat and collapse. Hana Ishikawa stood beside Sachiko at the railing, gripping the metal so hard her knuckles had gone completely white. "It's not real," she whispered in a shaking voice. "It has to be a stage set, some kind of elaborate trick." But stage sets don't smell like diesel fuel and salt air. Stage sets don't hum with electrical power running through every building. Stage sets don't stretch all the way to the horizon in every single direction, solid and real and utterly devastatingly intact. An American sailor walked past them right then, whistling some tune, hands casually stuffed in his pockets. Just another boring Tuesday in San Francisco. He glanced at the Japanese women with mild curiosity, nodded politely, and kept right on walking. To him, all of this, the city, the impossible abundance, the raw power, it was just completely normal everyday life. Sachiko had to turn away from the railing because she literally couldn't look anymore. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, like her brain was tearing itself apart. Everything she had been taught her entire life, everything she had believed with absolute certainty, everything she had sacrificed for, it was all collapsing like paper thrown into a fire. If America looked like this right now, after 4 solid years of total warfare, what had it looked like before the war even started? And even more terrifying, if this was just one of their coastal cities, what did their industrial heartland possibly look like? The train journey inland answered that question with absolutely brutal clarity. The women were transferred onto a real passenger train, not a military transport but an actual civilian passenger train with cushioned seats and clean windows and even a dining car, and they rode east toward Wisconsin for 3 long days. For 72 hours straight, they watched America scroll past those windows like some kind of propaganda film running in reverse, except this was real. Farmland stretched out endlessly in every direction, impossibly vast beyond anything they could have imagined. Wheat fields glowing golden in the autumn sun, stretching all the way to horizons that seemed to curve with the earth itself. Orchards absolutely heavy with ripe fruit, trees planted in perfect geometric rows for what must have been hundreds of acres. Cattle grazing in pastures so enormous the herds looked like tiny distant dots. Grain silos as tall as office buildings, filled to bursting with surplus grain the nation literally couldn't even consume. Yuki Tanaka, the nurse who had written that prophetic line in her journal back on the ship, sat pressed against the window watching Kansas blur past outside. She had grown up in a small farming village outside Osaka, so she knew agriculture intimately, understood the absolutely backbreaking labor of rice cultivation, knew how a single bad storm or pest infestation could destroy an entire harvest and doom a whole family to starvation. What she was seeing through this train window wasn't farming the way she understood it. This was something completely different, industrial and mechanized and abundant beyond any reasonable comprehension. At one stop in some small Nebraska town with maybe 2,000 people living there, Local children were playing on the train platform. American children, just regular kids. The Japanese women watched them through the windows in absolute silence. These children were tall and healthy. Their clothes were clean and well made. Their cheeks were full and round. Their teeth were straight and perfectly white. They laughed and chased each other around with the unthinking, boundless energy that only comes from being genuinely well-fed your entire life. Sachiko thought about her little brother back home. 8 years old and barely 4 feet tall. His growth permanently stunted from years of malnutrition. These American children, some of them clearly younger than him, stood taller and weighed more and moved with a physical strength he would simply never have. The comparison wasn't just humbling or embarrassing. It was absolutely annihilating to witness. One little girl, maybe 10 years old, stood on the platform eating a bright red apple. She took 3 casual bites, apparently decided she didn't want it anymore, and just tossed it into a nearby trash bin without a second thought. 3 bites and then straight into the garbage. Sachiko watched that apple disappear and felt something absolutely fundamental break inside her understanding of how the world worked. This wasn't just abundance, this was waste. Casual, careless, thoughtless waste born from such profound plenty that individual pieces of food literally had no value whatsoever. On the 3rd day of the train journey, they passed through Gary, Indiana, and massive steel mills lined the entire horizon. Smokestacks breathing fire into the dusky sky. Blast furnaces glowing bright orange in the gathering darkness. The mills run 24 hours a day, the interpreter explained casually. 3 full shifts of workers. They ran that way throughout the entire war, producing steel for ships and tanks and aircraft carriers. They produced so much steel that America built more warships in 1943 alone than Japan had managed to construct in its entire history as a nation. Kiko Sato stared at those glowing mills and started doing math in her head. She had been a mathematics student before the war, recruited into radio operations specifically because of her technical skills with numbers. She knew how to calculate, and the numbers she was working out right now didn't just spell defeat. They spelled complete impossibility. Japan never had a chance, she said out loud to no one in particular. Not against this. Not against a nation that could field massive armies and feed them incredibly well and run steel mills around the clock in 3 shifts and still somehow have enough surplus left over to throw food away and let children waste perfectly good apples. Several women nearby turned to look at her when she said it. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The train finally slowed into a rail siding and buses carried the women the last few miles to what they assumed would be their prison. They braced themselves for the worst, barbed wire and concrete cells and guard towers with machine guns. Instead, they found simple wooden barracks equipped with heating stoves, facilities with hot running showers, a mess hall serving 3 full meals daily, and even a recreation yard with actual grass growing in it. That first hot shower broke dozens of them emotionally. Sachiko stood beneath the endless stream of hot, clean water for a full 20 minutes, watching soap suds pool around her feet, sobbing uncontrollably. When was the last time she had been truly properly clean? Back in Japan, soap had completely vanished years ago. Ordinary civilians washed themselves with wood ash and icy cold water and desperate prayers. Here in this prison camp, soap came in large cardboard boxes and American guards handed it out freely to prisoners like it cost absolutely nothing, because to America it genuinely didn't. The same factories that built strategic bombers could apparently drown the entire world in soap if they wanted to.